Okay, I think we can start up again. So, we want to talk now about knocking combustion. So I want to show you some results that we obtained with the same models that we've been discussing here. Recall that we have the flame propagation modeled with the G equation. That corresponds to, or allows us to resolve the region of transition from unburnt fuel to burnt fuel in that narrow combustion zone we call a flame. But ahead of that flame and behind that flame, we still have reactants that can undergo chemical reaction. And in fact, in a case of a premixed mixture, you can have combustion occurring ahead of the flame, sometimes referred to as NOC. So that's what I want to refer to now. So we, in that same engine I just showed you, the Pentroof engine, monitored the pressure in the combustion chamber at a variety of points we call numerical pressure transducers, if you like. So in the cell adjacent to each of those locations, we could monitor the cylinder pressure. And if we looked at position 1, that's between the exhaust valves here, you see that there's some wiggles in the pressure trace. And if you pass that through an appropriate filter, you can get the curve shown below, which is kind of the, you filtered out the DC component, if you like. You're left with just the fluctuating component. And you can really accentuate that there's a certain phenomenon occurring close to the peak in the heat release. Although I'm just showing you the pressure here, but that follows. And you can monitor the magnitude of these pressure fluctuations. We call that PP here. So how do you pick the filter, the bandpass filter? Well, we use some results from many years ago from Draper. He wrote a paper, he was at MIT, where he used classical wave equation to look at the resonant frequencies in a cylindrical domain, like in an engine, where basically the frequencies are characterized by the bore, or actually in this case the circumference, pi times the bore, and the sound speed in the mixture. And there are various resonant modes, radial and circumferential modes. I'll talk more about them in a minute. But basically there's a certain frequency associated with those waves. And for our particular case, we saw that the resonant frequencies were in a range between 6 and roughly 20 kilohertz. So basically, we filter the calculated pressure trace in the range of 5 to 25 kilohertz to make sure that we capture all of these resonant frequencies. So, okay, now you have these blue curves. We can add them together over the 8 numerical transducers that you see here and develop a parameter called the NOC Index. And we can watch how that NOC Index changes with crank angle. We're also interested in PDV work, so we keep track of what's called the power index here, which is basically just the pressure volume work term divided by the engine displacement. So we're going to be looking at what happens when you change the ignition time. And obviously that's going to have an effect also on NOC. So this plot here shows what's happening. In this case, it's a direct injection engine operating at 1500 RPM. It's turbocharged or boosted, stoichiometric combustion, overall stoichiometric. So that means that there's been plenty of time with the early injection to create a more or less homogeneous mixture in the combustion chamber, even though it's direct injected. You see the injection timing is 270 degrees before top dead center, so during the intake stroke. And we're going to look at what happens when you change the spark timing from 25 to retarded timing of minus 10 degrees before top dead center. So this plot here shows the NOC index, and as you can see, as you might expect, if I spark the mixture early, I'm more likely to see evidence of NOC because basically the energy release is occurring early in the cycle and there's higher disturbances generated in the combustion chamber. And this leads to increases in NOC. Over a wide range of spark timing, you see that the power basically remains very similar. It's only for the very late case here that there's a drop-off in power. So the cases all have similar indicated mean effective pressure, if you like, but you can see the NOC is significantly different. So this just shows that in more detail. We're looking at transducer number 6 here. The spark timing ranging from minus 25 before top dead center, showing signs of severe NOC. You can see that in the pressure trace, the wiggles here, all the way to the latest spark timing of 10 degrees before top dead center, which show very light NOC, right? Very small amplitude fluctuations. Okay, so what is actually going on in the combustion chamber, and what do the models say about this? So I'm looking at a plan view of the combustion chamber, and the spark plug is located near the center of this pent-roof chamber. The white region that you see here is just the metal, right? We're cutting a plane through the engine, and so there's portions of the engine that are obscured. But basically, the black line, which is visible in each of these pictures here, shows the G equation prediction of the flame location as a function of crank angle. So here we have the case with severe NOC. This is 10 degrees after the spark. You see the flame starting to propagate across the combustion chamber. And at a certain moment, you notice the G equation predicted flame location is lagging behind the high temperature regions that are being predicted ahead of the flame. We think that this is where ignition is occurring spontaneously, right, due to chemistry effects. In other words, here the high temperature regions are behind the flame. The flame basically has ignited the reactants. But at a certain moment, you start to see ignition occurring ahead of the flame. And we interpret that in the models to be evidence of NOC. So here you see the case with severe NOC. There's significant red or burnt high temperature regions ahead of the flame. For the retarded timing case, we have only light NOC, and here you see very little evidence of combustion occurring ahead of the black G equals 0 surface. Okay, so the factors that affect this NOC intensity would be obviously the end gas, the gas ahead of the flame, its auto-ignition tendency. So what kind of fuel you use. For example, if we add a very high octane fuel to our mixture, like mix it with ethanol, we can inhibit NOC. All right. So the other thing is here we're looking at one of those locations, and in this case, looking at the effect of changing the numerical time step in the simulation. These are waves, as I'll show you in a minute, that propagate across the combustion chamber. They have a lot of different structures, these resonance modes ranging from radial modes to azimuthal modes. And you have to be able to resolve that. If you do a calculation based on the estimate of the acoustic wave speed, the sound speed, and the dimensions of your mesh, you find that you need very, very small time steps in order to actually monitor a pressure wave crossing the mesh. So you see the time steps here all the way down to 100 nanoseconds in a simulation. You can see that you need very small time steps in order to be able to capture these waves. You can take the signal and perform a Fourier transform, having passed it through a bandpass filter and so on. And you see peaks here in the power spectrum that correspond to various modes of resonance. Down here, almost invisible, I apologize, are the calculated peak frequencies as compared with Draper's predicted peak frequencies for the various modes. Those modes can be identified by these peaks here in the Fourier transform. And there's reasonable agreement. So this movie is kind of interesting. It was made by a postdoc who was visiting us, where he essentially looked at the combustion chamber and plotted the pressure field just at the beginning of NOC. Down here in the plan view, if you watch the movie, this is the temperature field. And you'll see the pressure waves causing the high temperature zone to be convected back and forth. The peak here would be the instantaneous peak pressure in the combustion chamber. Again, the average pressure would be obviously the average that you're seeing here. And there are going to be pressures lower than the average and pressures higher than the average. But it's very interesting to watch this. So you're seeing it right at the sort of onset of NOC here, and as crank angle proceeds or time proceeds, you'll see the pressure signal dying down. So you can see a general kind of a slushing back and forth, right? That corresponds to one of those 1-0 radial modes. But superimposed on that, let's see if I can show it again, are actually azimuthal modes as well. And you see in the plot at the bottom, this high temperature region being swept back and forth. So he also compared those results against measurements that were made in an optical engine. These measurements were actually made by the group in Naples. Again, it was one of the Bowditch piston arrangements and an optical engine. And they looked at some of the species that contribute to the onset of NOC. They noticed the aldehydes and all of those things we spoke about for the low temperature or first stage combustion, followed by the OH species. Simulation is shown here. So the white line, the white surface is the flame propagating out. And the NOC, you can see it starts right here. In this case, the spark plug was slightly offset, causing the NOC to start at one end of the chamber, giving rise to a very strong first resonance in this first radial mode, where the fluid is sloshing back and forth. So that's this peak you see here. But then there are other modes, including an azimuthal mode or circumferential mode, and then a second order radial mode that has power spectrum contributions. Okay. Yeah.
When you turn your overhead with these we actually final in to location or to verify location.
Yeah, oh yes, yeah, that was part of what we did here. But you know, there's a huge amount of data that you're getting, because at each point you're getting a pressure curve that you have to examine pretty carefully, making sure you filter out the correct, you don't filter out the frequencies of interest and so on. But the other interesting thing that we discovered in the course of the simulations is that NOC has a huge effect on heat transfer. Well, people know this, and that's one of the reasons you want to avoid it, aside from the fact that the high pressures that are created can also damage the engine. But basically, what I'm showing you here is the velocity field. You can see, if you could see the magnitudes here, that the velocities are of the order of several hundred meters per second, associated with these waves propagating back and forth across the combustion chamber, say in the radial modes. They generate really high velocities. Well, high velocities, if you remember from your heat transfer classes, generate high heat flux. So what you see here is a plot showing that. This is energy. This is the fuel energy, in other words, the energy consumed during combustion. And then down here, we're looking at the heat loss to the walls. So if there is no NOC, what we predict is this blue curve down here, where basically the heat loss is just a small fraction of the total fuel energy. On the other hand, if you now operate with a spark timing such that you obtain NOC, what you find is a big augmentation of heat loss. This looks like more than a factor of 2 increase in heat loss to the walls. When we saw this, we thought, well, I wonder how accurate our wall heat transfer models are. So we went back to the equations that I discussed with you when we were discussing heat transfer. And if you remember, the standard law of the wall gives you this term here. We had another term that had source terms due to combustion. But if you go back and look at the equations, you see that there's also another contribution due to pressure changes with time. In other words, pressure work terms. So in addition to combustion heat transfer, you have a dP/dT term. So we included that in the simulations. And now you see the heat loss is this red curve. And we're predicting that the energy loss due to heat transfer can be as much as 40% of the total fuel energy under heavy knocking conditions, nearly 4 times the heat transfer you'd have with a non-knocking condition. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, those waves are propagating back and forth with very high induced velocities in the region of the boundary layers above the wall, enhancing the heat transfer. So the other thing that is of great interest in the field is a phenomenon known as super NOC. And here I'm just going to be summarizing a recent paper actually done by the same visiting student who's now a professor at Tsinghua, where they looked at super NOC. So this is severe engine NOC that is triggered by pre-ignition. That means ahead of the flame. Sometimes after many thousands of engine cycles. So it's seemingly a random event. Here you see as a function of cycle number, engine is running along really nicely, compression, combustion, expansion, compression, combustion, expansion. And then suddenly you have this huge rise in pressure in the combustion chamber, which of course can really damage the engine if it is sufficiently high. This was kind of their threshold that they wanted not to exceed. And you can see that several cycles went beyond that. So this phenomenon could be pinpointed on a load speed diagram. If you look at these lines you see here, these are fuel consumption lines for a normally aspirated engine, the blue data, and then for a turbocharged gasoline engine, the red lines. And you can see here that you start to see this super NOC phenomenon occurring at low engine speed when there's enough time for all of this stuff to develop. In other words, for the ignition to occur spontaneously, and at high loads where you have a lot of fuel in the combustion chamber. So this is kind of the danger zone. The reason this zone is of interest, though, is because as people talk about downsizing engines, they're talking about increasing the brake mean effective pressure or the load in the engine and reducing the engine speed to reduce friction. And so this would be potentially a disaster if you downsized an engine, it operates at higher loads, and now you start to see these effects. And they have some pictures in their paper that show some of the results of this super NOC. Basically, you can essentially destroy your spark plug, your valves, and also see major damage to the piston, especially in the ringland region. So here are some pressure traces where this is from an engine, an operating engine. Here's your compression, you have your spark ignition here, and here would be a normal combustion trace. Here you see some what look like okay, slightly advanced timing cases. And then suddenly you have one of these huge pressure events creating the super NOC. And then that follows shortly after by more or less normal cycles again. And then back again, you see another one of these pre-ignition effects. So a lot of discussion about what it is that creates this. People think of this as sometimes being brought about by hotspots in the combustion chamber, particles that are perhaps escaping from the ring crevice region. And there's still discussion. But one interesting thing in their paper was that they basically did some constant volume simulations with a surrogate fuel and showed that if you define the combustion event or characterize it by the time, the ignition time, that you could identify a trajectory of pressure versus temperature below which you would expect normal combustion and above which the ignition would occur so fast that you might expect a detonation event. And so they used this boundary here to kind of give a hint as to what the conditions would have to be in the combustion chamber in order to undergo a transition from your turbulent flame propagation to a detonation, which might lead to this effect. And so just conceptually, they're saying that this might be due to deposits that are formed in the vicinity of the surfaces of the engine. In fact, I've seen some videos made by Japanese researchers from, I guess it was Mazda, that show actually glowing particles that lead to the ignition process and these uncontrolled detonation events. The other interesting thing is recently people have determined that the ring pack is playing a very important role here. What's happening over here? You can have oil particles, for instance, coming into the combustion chamber. The oil is typically a long chain alkane with a short ignition delay. That can serve as an ignition site for the gases ahead of the propagating flame. And in fact, Southwest Research has a piston design where they essentially remove the top land crevice here, and they find they can suppress this event drastically, giving more evidence that the ring pack is playing a role. So to summarize then this section of the presentation, I think I've shown you that CFD modeling is capable of describing both diesel and spark ignition combustion characteristics over wide ranges. Diesel combustion, basically mixing controlled, and pre-mixed combustion can both be represented in the models without using subgrid scale turbulence chemistry interactions. The effect of turbulence on combustion can be modeled, however, using an integrated G equation-based combustion model coupled with detailed kinetics. What we saw today was very similar results can be achieved with and without consideration of flame propagation in diesel combustion, in conventional diesel combustion. And that's because the mixing is controlled by the injection and the turbulence generated. The G equation propagation model does reveal edge flames at the liftoff length, the liftoff location of a lifted diesel flame. But that edge flame obviously would not be seen if you had kinetics only. All you would see is a sudden appearance of OH. Flame propagation dominated premixed charge spark ignition engine combustion does require specification of a turbulent flame speed, which is basically the result of turbulence chemistry interactions occurring at scales below the resolution of your calculation. The model that we use here, we've given the acronym GAMET, the G equation for all mixtures, a universal turbulent combustion model, allows you to essentially cover all of those regimes. And then, of course, integration of this model with the chemistry model allows you to predict both diesel ignition and spark ignition engine NOC processes. Questions about this? Yeah.
So, since you're not exactly sure what causes the super NOC, I'm just curious how you were able to run your experiment. So, did you just run at that particular regime?
Yeah, so when you talk to people who do this type of work, it's pretty frustrating, especially if you have an optical engine and you want to take a picture of it. You might have to run the engine for hours before this suddenly happens. And then, of course, you know, it's only one frame in the movie, or one short set of frames. Very difficult experiments.
And another question is, in your earlier part where you changed the spark timing to look at the frequency, so it seems like it knocks at all the spark timing, or would it make the knock somehow? Or?
Right, so the question is, do you see NOC at all spark timings? NOC shows up as pressure variations across the combustion chamber, right? And we're just talking about the magnitude of those pressure fluctuations. Earlier, I told you about the Lagrange ballistics assumption, where basically, if you look at the characteristics, you would argue that the pressure should be uniform everywhere in the combustion chamber. But because of the fact that we now have ignition occurring at locations that are distinct, pressure waves are created that travel across the combustion chamber and excite these resonant modes. That's always going to happen. The issue is how much do you excite them? And if you can keep that excitation low, you don't have to worry about NOC.
So, because even at 10 degrees before Dr. Center, the picture still said light.
Yeah, yeah. So again, the question is, when would you get rid of NOC altogether? Well, if you ran your engine at high speed, for instance, so there's just no time available for that to show up, or more dilute, so that you don't excite this. I mean, basically, you're hitting the engine with a hammer, right? You're exciting these resonant modes. If you can prevent hitting it hard, you don't excite those modes. Yeah?
I'm in favor of identifying the NOC from the first reference mode to be around some kilohertz.
6 kilohertz, I guess, in this engine here.
Yeah, I'm showing your previous slide. But I'm wondering if there's any physical chemistry explanation for the number.
That number is just wave propagation across the chamber. I know the speed of sound. I know the diameter. I look at... It's got nothing to do with the fuel. It's just the geometry and the temperature, because the sound speed depends on temperature. Okay.
I noticed the different work is based on the simulation. Is there any experiments?
I showed experimental results that were taken at Tsinghua there. Yep. So all of that fuel that's ahead of the flame goes off with a bang. Yeah. Sure. Okay, so, in homogeneous charge, compression ignition, you cannot really run that engine with stoichiometric fuel, because if it all went off in a bang, you'd get a huge pressure rise. Well, that's what you're seeing in this case. There's a lot of fuel ahead of the flame that spontaneously ignites. So the reason that it's a problem is you're not running with lean stoichiometry like you are in an HCCI engine. And it's even a problem in an HCCI engine unless you're really lean.
Is there any experimental work to validate the difference of its definition?
Oh, no. It's a theory. So it's not known exactly what's happening, but you can see essentially you're having volumetric heat release that is consuming all of the fuel ahead of the flame. I mean, that you can just see that from an energy balance, if you like. But the details of that, whether it's an actual detonation wave or whether you're somewhere in between a propagating wave and so on, those details, I think, still need to be revealed. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Are there any modifications that need to be made to the engine setup to run kind of I'm assuming they cater to it over and over again.
So run at low speed and run at high BMEP, and you're going to get it. You saw that.
For the engine itself, it is knocking so many times. I'm just wondering, has there been any damage?
Oh, absolutely. People have destroyed engines with super knock. That's why it's such a problem.
In your lab setup.
Yeah.
Because you have to run it again and again. So I'm asking if you take any steps to make sure that you know it's going to knock, that's really fine too.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any steps you take to cushion it or you just use that to fix it later?
I think you need a lot of grad students who can assemble engines. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the part 8. Yeah.
So, obviously you've been very successful at producing models. Is there anything, maybe I missed it, is there anything that's happening in Supernaut that's specifically more models?
I do not know of any evidence that would point to anything different. But, you know, if you look at the theory of detonation waves, essentially you require a wave, all right? And there's heat release occurring behind a shock wave. And what would you see? You'd see a propagating front. Well, we're seeing that here. We're seeing pressure waves propagating across the combustion chamber. No one that I know of has measured their Mach number. You could infer it from the simulation. I don't know if I would believe it, though, because you need really high resolution in time to be able to track these waves very accurately. But that would be what would be required, right, is to look at the Mach number, somehow decompose the fact that you have various modes, not just a radial mode, but you have those circumferential modes. And I'm not sure that people know that much about detonation waves to be able to say how they operate in such a complex environment. But that would be a great research topic, on the one hand. On the other hand, you don't want this. So the more important research topic is how do you avoid it? Oh, sure. That's like when people would ask, why are you developing soot models? We don't want any soot. So, well, you need to know how to avoid it, right? So you've got to know what makes soot. Okay, so I want to start on the discussion of optimization and more details of low temperature combustion. So having these models available, the question became, can we use the models to help optimize internal combustion engines? So we looked at the literature to see what optimization tools were available. You know, the first one here is try everything. Okay, well, obviously that's not very efficient. We can use calculus or gradient-based search techniques. The problem is with a CFD code, you don't have access to the type of information you'd need that would allow you to use a gradient-based system, at least in our situation where we have so many equations and we have Lagrangian droplets and Eulerian fluid and so on. So the approaches that are more random, like the genetic algorithm, seem to have more appeal. Of course, in industry, they often use one factor at a time or univariate searches or design of experiments. But we wanted to have tools that would cover a large range of variables in a search. And so we described some of this in a book that we published a couple of years ago on optimization of internal combustion engines. And as I mentioned, the technique that we kind of homed in on was the genetic algorithm. Just to give you a brief idea of how that works, you'll run a whole bunch of cases with different input parameters that cover the range of search space you're interested in. Then you take a look at the results and you pick those individuals that gave you the best performance in terms of some metrics that you are interested in. You then blend the characteristics of these individuals and create a new population and repeat this process until the winner is observed. So how does this work? It's very interesting. It uses concepts from genetics, all right? The idea here is that we have these variables we're trying to optimize, x1, x2, x3. That could be injection pressure, EGR rate, the diameter of the piston. I mean, this could be anything that you want. And you would represent them in a gene string, like a chromosome. The number of digits that you have here to represent this first variable, say injection pressure, is determining the precision, right, the lambda here. And then the range over which the injection pressure would be varied gives you this the precision over that range. So basically, the number of digits here is determined based on the range you want to cover and how accurately. So you've got this long string of zeros and ones. And each string is unique, and each of those strings represents one individual. So here's, for example, one parent. Here's another parent. You selected them because they exhibited good characteristics. You ran the code. You found, wow, this one gives me very good fuel efficiency. This one also gives good fuel efficiency and good nitric oxide. So you've picked them. These are the two parents that you would like to encourage to reproduce. So you pick at random a certain bit location here, which would be essentially cutting the chromosome, and you switch the two so that you create a baby that has some of the characteristics of each parent. So here are the descendants that you obtain, and you can generate as many descendants as you want, depending on where you cut these chromosome strings and rearrange them. And then you can even do stuff like randomly flip one of the bits in the system to provide some diversity in the system. So we've used this technique, and we've actually developed or taken techniques developed by Coelho to look at multi-objective genetic algorithm. So here, you're not just looking at fuel consumption, but you can specify as many objectives as you wish. In this case, fuel consumption, nitric oxide, soot, but you can have as many as you like. Yeah. Okay, so as I mentioned, each of those bits is if I take this binary string here, it represents a number, which might be the injection pressure, all right? This string here might be, I don't know, the EGR rate. And I can, if I know how to convert binary into numbers, I could tell you what that number was, but it's just a number, yeah. And so you know that the first 10 bits here represent the injection pressure, the next, 6 or 5 represent EGR, or whatever you want, okay? And as I say, the precision here is determined by the range over which you want to look at the variables and how many subdivisions you would like to include. When you're all done, one individual has this long string of bits. That's his chromosome. All right? Right. You're saying it might push you outside the range of interest here? Yeah, that's allowed, right? Because you want a diverse population. And since you're going to be running the computer code with this new input, if you choose something totally outrageous, the code will probably crash. So you have some checks. But even so, the results might be horrible, and you would throw away that citizen. Okay, so this just shows the results after you've done some simulations. I should mention at Wisconsin, we have access to 4,000 computers on campus. They are in teaching labs and so on around the campus. And when a student comes to one of those computers that's busy running your job and touches the mouse, the job is transferred to another computer somewhere that's not being used. So we can get a really great turnaround. We can submit hundreds of jobs that take more than a day each, and then catch or collect all the data, analyze it to find the good performers. And so here you see each of these red dots might be a case that was run. The blue dots correspond to the ones that we consider to be optimal in a sense, right? They are optimal in the sense that they satisfy a Pareto requirement, that there's nothing to the left of those variables in this space. So the other thing is you've done all these runs and you've found some cases that are potentially optimal, but let's not throw away all the other data. We use the other data to determine response surface curves, all right? And so for instance, here I'm showing you nitric oxides against the swirl ratio and the bowl diameter in the engine. And you can see that now I'm taking all these points here that there might be a case here or over here where you get low nitric oxide, that might be on one of these Pareto surfaces. But at least you'd understand what's causing these other cases to give the results they do by looking at this response surface plot. So I'll show an example of that. So this is from Caroline Genzale's PhD work, where she wanted to optimize a piston bowl design for a diesel engine and chose 7 geometry parameters. So the pip height, that's the center height of the bowl. The bowl diameter, the diameter of the bottom of the bowl, so that's essentially the curvature on the side wall here, and then curvature control points. She was also interested in the spray angle, the injector spray angle, and then also the swirl ratio in the combustion chamber. So the idea here is we want to vary those parameters over reasonable ranges while optimizing the NOx, the soot, and the indicated fuel consumption. Doing this experimentally would be almost impossible. Think of how many pistons you would have to cut and install and then run. So this really shows the power of these tools, these simulation tools. Yeah. Yeah, so we discussed this in that book. If you're interested, you can take a look at it. But typically a DOE would have fewer, the search space that you can span is more restricted. And that you can potentially miss local optima. With a GA, you tend to be able to find those local optima more readily. It gives, yeah, we've actually used both GAs and DOEs in the lab. And the students prefer the DOEs because you're kind of more in touch with, the ranges, and you don't have this surprise where suddenly you're asked to run the engine at 50,000 RPM because that just happened to come out of the random selection. So the DOE is more controlled, but you can miss optima or the location of optimum points. Yeah. Right. So this is multi-objective optimization. And essentially what you're looking for is I'll show you this in a minute, a simultaneous, you're basically playing off one parameter against another. And on the next slide, I'll show you what that really means. Okay. So here's the Pareto front that corresponded to all of the runs that were done, varying those 7 parameters that you saw. And you can identify, following the question we just asked, certain interesting cases, okay, shown in the triangles there. So if you look at these cases, you see relative to a baseline design, if we chose this piston design and this spray angle and this swirl ratio, NOx reduced drastically. But unfortunately, particulates went up. So on this plot here, we essentially moved towards 0 NOx, but we moved in that direction with soot. So you can see there's a playoff against those 2 variables. But the fuel efficiency also deteriorated. So this design is not necessarily a good design, even though it's on this Pareto surface. It would be one that you might want to avoid. On the other hand, if I go down to this guy, I see I have reduction in NOx, modest reduction, reduction in particulates, and a reduction in fuel consumption. So this design looks like it might be interesting. And of course, there are other designs in between where you have bigger changes in both NOx and soot, but less impressive changes in fuel efficiency. One thing you do notice, though, is that as I move down the Pareto surface here, I'm increasing the swirl ratio. So at least we can see there's a trend with respect to that variable. But we would like to understand that better. So what is it? Is it the bowl geometry, which is changing significantly? You see here, I have a more shallow bowl. Here I have a very deep bowl. And as I change the spray angle, I'm targeting the spray in different locations, what is it that's actually creating the differences in the performance that you're seeing? So that's where the response surfaces and the regression data comes in. So now we take all of the data from all of the runs, and we take a look at, for instance, the soot, and here we have the soot against the variables that we were changing, the spray angle, the swirl ratio, the bowl diameter, and what was that last one there? The pip height. And you can see from looking at this set of data that there are actually 3 parameters that seem to dominate the soot. Namely, the spray angle. You see there's a big dependence on spray angle here. Swirl ratio. There's a dependence on the swirl ratio. And the bowl diameter. In other words, how the size of the combustion chamber bowl. These all had, by the way, the same compression ratio. And so when you cause the deeper bowl, you then obviously have to have a smaller diameter bowl. You notice that the results show that the pip height really plays no role whatsoever, right? There's no change in soot with pip height. So by combining the understanding you get from the response surface regression with the Pareto front, you can understand the factors that lead to these optimums or optima. So, for instance, here we saw the explanation for the low soot, the low NOx, and the low fuel efficiency. You can see from the response surface here that there's an optimum spray angle that's around here. You can see that the swirl ratio is predicted to enhance the soot reduction, particularly near the optimum spray angle. And you can increase the soot emissions, or you would increase the soot emissions if you have narrow spray angles, so you want to avoid that. And increased swirl is predicted to decrease soot for all bowl diameters. So those are parameters that you can get from this type of optimization that are extremely helpful in engine design. I'm just showing you results at one operating point here. Obviously, you want to repeat this exercise over a wide range of operating points in general. Okay, so let me just discuss a little bit now low temperature combustion. So we have these tools that allow you to perform these optimization exercises. We're interested in low temperature combustion because we know that we can use that to control nitric oxide and particulates, and also to improve efficiency, as you'll see, because we can reduce the temperature difference between the combustion gases and the surrounding combustion chamber walls, and therefore reduce heat loss. So if you look at the various combustion regimes that we've been discussing, we discussed PCCI, where you have very early injection, standard or conventional diesel combustion with a premix burn and a diffusion burn. And of interest also is so-called MK combustion, modified kinetics combustion of Nissan, where they have late injection occurring after top dead center, pistons on the way down. And so you have low temperature combustion if you wait long enough because the expanding gases are cooling. So there are, of course, challenges associated with all of these operating modes, one of them being the response to the emissions. For PCCI, you see combustion is occurring in this kind of bang early in the cycle. This leads to high NOx levels, which requires then high exhaust gas recirculated in the engine to dilute the mixture to lower temperatures, as we discussed when we were talking about the low temperature combustion case with the long ignition delay. So for standard diesel combustion, actually you can keep the NOx under control, but at the expense of increased soot. And so you'll see the soot-NOx trade-off, where the things you do to reduce soot, like, for example, adding more oxygen by higher injection pressures and so on, often lead then to higher NOx. So that's the characteristic of standard diesel combustion. And then the late combustion strategy, the MK combustion, Seems to be great because you can lower soot and NOx. The problem there is you find high unburnt fuel if you don't do it right, because basically everything is extinguishing as the piston is moving down, and also limits you in terms of the load that can be accepted by that combustion strategy. So these are motivations then for looking at the low temperature combustion regimes, including RCCI, HCCI, PCCI, and so on. So starting point for us was to say, all right, well, what fuel would you want to use if you were interested in low temperature combustion? So we did HCCI calculations in a heavy-duty diesel engine, a Caterpillar engine I'll describe to you later, where basically we assumed we had a homogeneous mixture of fuel and air in such a proportion that we would be running at about a 6 bar indicated mean effective pressure. And we varied the primary reference fuel number, if you like, or composition, using isooctane and N-heptane as our surrogates. Isooctane having the 100 PRF number and N-heptane having 0, right? So blending those two, we can change the PRF number of the fuel or the octane number of the fuel, and the EGR rate. And what you're seeing in these plots is the calculated indicated specific fuel consumption for over this range of PRF and EGR rate. So we're injecting the same fuel energy, or mixing rather the air with the same fuel energy. In each case, it's homogeneous, premixed. And we're looking at it at one particular speed, 1300 RPM. What you see from this plot here is that there's a certain range of PRFs or octane numbers where you just don't have combustion. Then there's another range over here where the combustion is more favorable. But the stars you see here represent the pressure rise rate. And as you move into this more favorable region, the pressure rise rate increases drastically. So you really want small stars. Huh? You want to operate in the small star region here, where you have reasonable pressure rise rates and, at the same time, reasonable indicated fuel consumptions. The point is, though, that at this load, if you operated with only gasoline, the engine wouldn't run. So basically, you wouldn't be able to run this engine with either neat diesel fuel or neat gasoline, because neat diesel would bring you down here, where you'd have tremendously high pressure rise rates. If you go to a slightly increased load, here we're at 9 bar, what you find is that misfire region is now shrunk, so you can actually operate with just gasoline, or close to operating with just gasoline. Poor fuel economy, though, in the red region here. And also, it's more tolerant to the EGR that you choose. You don't see that really fast drop-off. The small star region here would give you reasonable pressure rise rates and also fairly reasonable fuel efficiencies. But once again, you wouldn't want to operate this engine with either neat diesel or neat gasoline. And when you get to 11 bar, this is a sort of medium load point for a heavy-duty diesel engine. Again, you see there's a range of EGR rates that lead to misfire. In other words, the ignition delay is so long that in the time available at 1300 RPM, you don't get combustion. But there are ranges here where you can get reasonable combustion as long as you're operating with PRF numbers or octane numbers suitable. You'll notice that you're moving to higher and higher octane numbers as you go up in load. So we thought, well, it seems like you're not able to use just one fuel, because depending on the load, you might want to have a more reactive fuel at light loads and less reactive fuel at high loads. So we thought, well, why don't we have fuel blending in the combustion chamber just to see what happens? So the idea here is we would have a premixed component of the fuel that would be introduced through, say, a port fuel injector. And then we would direct inject a more reactive fuel that would mix with the less reactive fuel, the less reactive premixed fuel. We decided to use a traditional diesel injector. It's actually a fairly large hole injector. And the MultiObjective genetic algorithm strategy that I discussed with you a few minutes ago. So basically, we took the results from the 9-bar operating point, where the global PRF number we chose was 65. So that would be basically 65% isooctane in the premix charge, and an EGR rate of 50. And the idea was to optimize the timing and amounts of injection, and we decided to use multiple injections to try to avoid having locally rich regions in the combustion chamber that might lead to soot formation. So here were our 2 injections. We even allowed the injection pressures to be different in each pulse, but later we found that that was not a requirement. And then we have 2 injection timings. We spanned a range from intake valve closure up to a time 20 degrees before the start of the second injection. In the second injection, we spanned from 50 to 30 degrees before top dead center. Early injections to create enough time for some mixing of the reactive and non-reactive fuels. And the fuel split between the diesel and gas and in these 2 pulses was from 0 to 100%. So those were the optimization parameters, and we ran our simulations. We minimized 2 objectives. One was the amount of wall film. Remember, I said when you inject fuel in the combustion chamber, if you don't do it right, the spray can reach the liner or the piston surfaces and create a film. We didn't want that, because if you do that, you are likely to create soot. And we also wanted to minimize the inhomogeneity of the octane number across the combustion chamber, again, to prevent the formation of particulates. So here's some results from the simulation. The primary reference fuel inhomogeneity is on this axis, and the amount of wall film is on this axis. And we identified Pareto solutions that seem to offer some promise in the simulation. And we picked one of them in particular here, where the amount of wall film was less than 1%, and the PRF inhomogeneity was a manageable number. We had done some simulations that gave us some criteria here. Inhomogeneity of the PRF, by the way, was found from a least squares analysis of the PRF number across the combustion chamber. We found that an optimum injection timing would be 67 before top dead center for the first injection, 30 before top dead center for the second, and with about 60% of the diesel fuel in the first pulse. So this is what we came up with in the CFD. At intake valve closure, the gasoline and the air are premixed, and that's why everything is red here. That the PRF number is 100. What our optimization showed us is that having 2 injections minimized the wall impingement problem, and also maintained a suitable stratification of the PRF number. So in these plots here, you'll see the blue region corresponding to the direct injected diesel fuel, the red being the premixed gasoline. And you see that the 2 pulses have the effect of altering the octane number of the gasoline, such that above the squish region here, you don't have just pure gasoline. And in the bowl region, you have a more presence of diesel fuel close to top dead center. And that turns out to control the ignition process. So basically, the idea is you would have an engine that is fueled with gasoline, like in your spark ignition engine in your car, with a low-cost port fuel injector, and then direct injection of diesel fuel, just like in your diesel engine. As I'll show you also, we don't need high injection pressures because we inject very early in the cycle. And also, we don't inject a whole lot of diesel fuel. As an example I showed you there was 35% diesel and 65% gasoline. So that also helps avoid impingement against the surfaces. Let's see. Okay, so after the break, which ends at 15:15, I'm going to show you some experimental results obtained with this strategy. But let's take a question.
You have to run EGR then after the
I'll talk about that later, but yes, you need EGR at high load. Yeah? This is with the well-stirred reactor. We've also done G equation modeling here, but generally the overall equivalence ratio is low, 0.3, 0.4. You wouldn't have flame propagation, or you wouldn't expect flame propagation to be important at low equivalence ratio. So you don't see any difference when you use the G model. Yeah. Yep, we vary that as well, yeah. Okay, so let's meet back at 15:15.